Okay, this week we're going to take a look at an introduction to objects. We talked a little bit about objects, but we're going to take a look at arrays briefly, and then take a look at loops and conditionals, and then we're going to come back more and look more in depth at objects and object constructors and how to make our own objects, which are really is a really cool thing to understand about JavaScript. But what I want to talk about right now is to sort of review from the previous week. And you've seen this miles per gallon calculator. I wanted to tell you about CodePen. I'm sure some of you already know about this. The URL is codepen.io, and you can set up a CodePen account. CodePen is basically a social development platform where you have three panes: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You don't necessarily have to use all the panes, but you can basically experiment with your code. And so you can see here that I've fooled around with our plain old miles per gallon calculator, which this week will be the last time we take a look at it. Oops. And in the HTML pane, it's pretty straightforward. What I've done is I want to start fooling around a little bit with DOM scripting. And so what I've done is I have when you're in the HTML pane, you're basically working within the body of the document, so you don't need all the HTML. That's assumed that you already have it. And so here I have a headline that says miles per gallon, but I have a div with the identifier mpg underscore sum. And then I use a little bit of simple CSS to stylize the headline and the background color of the body, which you can see here it's blue and white. And then over here I have my JavaScript. So this is progressive enhancement. Here we're separating our content from the presentation and or the display, and then our logic over here, our code. And as you can see, what I do here is I declare a variable distance, and then I'm prompting the user to get those miles driven. By default it's set to 0, and then I prompt them for the amount of fuel used, and then I declare another variable where we divide the distance by the fuel, and that's going to give us our fuel efficiency, right? But then look at what I'm doing here. I'm starting to work with a little bit with an object with and the document object and a method within the DOM. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a variable called mpgsum. And imagine it's very similar to the name for the identifier, right? And so when I'm working with it, I kind of keep them similar, because what I'm doing is I'm setting this variable to the value that is currently within that div, the node that's within the div, or that text node. There's nothing there right now, but there's still a node. It's just empty. And so what I'm doing is I'm using the getElementById method. The object is the document or the body of the page. The method is getElementById, and I'm passing this identifier, this string, to this method so that the browser will know to go and access whatever's in between that the opening and closing div tag of this element with this identifier mpg underscore sum. You see it here, and then store it in this variable. So what we're saying here is that I'm getting that value, and then down here I set it. And so here I'm saying set the mpg sum inner HTML to the following, which is essentially a string concatenated with the results of the calculation for fuel efficiency and another string. And so if I reload the page, then I'm going to get those dialog box that open. And I move my mouse a little bit, so but here I have miles driven. Let me put in 100 and click OK. And then my fuel used in gallons is 5. And then when I click OK, then down here I don't get another dialog box. Down here I get the result. And so what the script has done is it's gotten the element and then done the calculation and then posted the result within the body. And so that's where it's saying our efficiency is 20 miles per gallon. CodePen also includes JavaScript console, so you can play around with a console if you want, just like you can in the browser. Oh, so speaking of consoles, just wrapping up, this is CodePen. I'll turn on the link in Canvas so you can look at this um, little exercise if you want to. But speaking of the console, we also have a console that's built into the browser, and we know that we can turn that on by bringing up the developer tools. And so today, or this week, as I said, we're going to look at we continue to look at objects. So a minute ago, we just looked at the document object and one of the methods of the document object. Um, well, we can also get information about properties. So in the console, if I were to enter window.inner height, I'm basically asking the console to tell me what's the inner height, which is basically this area here, of the browser window, and it's 507 pixels. So it gives me that information. Um, this week we're also going to look at arrays. Arrays are objects, but they're also, you can consider them kind of like a variable, right? So an array is, let's say you have um, a bunch of items you want to store in a container. And you don't want to keep declaring a bunch of variables, especially if they're associated. Like, for example, this is the first time we're going to use the let keyword, and I want you to do some research on that. What does that mean and what does it apply to? So I'll talk about this some more, but what we're doing is we're creating a variable called dogs, or an array. And this array stores multiple elements. Here we have 3 elements. The interesting thing though, since the computer thinks in zeros and one, so the first element in the array, or index number, that holds this string is 0. So it's 0, 1, and then 2. But there are 3 elements in this array. This array has properties. I just said it. One of the properties is it has 3 elements in it. And so if I want to go and then I want to know, well, what's the length of this array, right? Then I can go ahead and get it. So dogs.length is 3. And so um, I've used this statement to get the length of the array. Arrays also have methods. So every object has properties, which we just saw is the length, and then methods. So um, if I wanted to add another element to this array, then I would use the push method to add the text Great Dane. And now it tells me that there are 4 elements in the array. Now, if I wanted to display all 4 of them individually, I would have to use a loop. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to learn loops this week. Because if we created an array and stored elements within the array that we later want to access, one of the ways that we can do it is by either using methods of the array object or using the for loop and looping through or iterating through the array. And so I'm just going to leave that there sort of as a primer for this week, and then we'll move on into the chapter. If you have any questions, post your questions at the questions forum. Thanks.